Good morning, and thank you very much, and welcome everyone. And I'm hoping that I can see here that David and Matt have both joined me. So, just as a way of introduction, my name's Dan Lister, and as mentioned, I am president of the Society of Light and Lighting this year, which is a subdivision of SIPSI, which you may be familiar with. But my day job is I lead the lighting consultancy, specialist lighting consultancy at Arup, and with 25 years of broad range of sector work. Across all sorts of different types of projects. But my current focus is on practical implementation of decarbonisation goals, as well as sort of looking at innovative procurement approaches and looking beyond the obvious. So part of sort of reimagining what we define building performance as. So, but joining me today, I've got David Hunt. He's the managing director of Glamox UK and Ireland, and for the last 4 years, and his background is in B2B sort of manufacturing sector in various commercial roles. Excited by rapidly developing opportunities in the UK market, combining the latest technologies, luminaires, and with control systems of building these things together. So, and committed to a sustainability agenda driving our industry and development in the UK manufacturing sector. And I've also got Matt Harwood, who works for Philips or Signify, as they're defined as, and he's got 15 years of experience in the sector, but specialises once again in sort of connected IoT lighting technology systems and services in the commercial, these services providing for the commercial office and industry sector. So welcome, David and Matt. Great to see you.
Morning,
again.
Dan. Morning, David.
Sorry, Dan. Yeah, morning.
So I guess the question that we've been set, and I'll start with the obvious one. Maybe it's not obvious, but LED technologies has been widely adopted by consumers, but commercial properties continue to lag behind. So why do we think this is the case? As a setting the context there, I'll start with David.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Dan. I mean, lots of reasons, but primarily it's the complexity of installation, of retrofit, of actually changing a complicated building with integrated systems. It's not simply a case of just changing the light bulb that you might be able to do at home. So I think they tend to be certainly in larger commercial buildings when there's lots of activity in the building. The building is always in sort of constant use. It's not easy to simply sort of say, right, we will launch a project to then go and create the retrofit of an existing building or replace old lighting systems with new lighting systems in quite the way that you would do at home. That said, I think many people have done this and are doing it. There are kind of many advantages in cost and energy saving, very much part of a sustainability story. And obviously with things like the Roche directive now driving things, it's going to happen over the next few years. People are going to have to form the project and do the conversions, do the retrofits as well. We're seeing actually at Glamox a lot of this type of work. So I think really it's just complexity of doing it, but I think it's going to pick up now for sure. It has to.
I'll come back to Roche in a minute, but I'll actually ask Matt. But yeah, are you seeing similar, Matt?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I think you have to remember it's been quite a turbulent few years for a lot of businesses as well. So yes, the change is hard, but the reasons to do so are still compelling. We can reduce our energy load, our carbon load, and therefore decrease, a business's costs. So it's definitely a good thing to change lighting, but sometimes doing so can be quite complex. But I think also, it's up to us as an industry to present good, credible business cases to clients to show them that by making the switch that yes, they need to spend to save, but that investment pays for itself very quickly in most instances. So with a good credible business case and a strong, backed by a strong lighting design to make sure that when you make the switch that you're getting what you expect in terms of compliant lighting, but also the business case behind it that says, when I make this change, this is the kind of return on investment I can expect. And typically it's as low as 2 years in many cases, up to 5 years on the more complicated sites.
And I think that's quite interesting. We kind of we've jumped into there's a couple of threads there I want to pull on, and I'm going to start with So what are the drivers? And we've mentioned Roche. I'll come back to that in a minute because I think that's an important part of it. We've mentioned, it mentions, costs. Are there anything else that we think that are drivers that people should be aware of if they're not? Maybe they are.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, sustainability is now high on everybody's agenda. Building decarbonisation is also high on everyone's agenda. So when we look at those, lighting is an obvious win. It's a quick win. It typically represents anywhere between 25 and 50% of a building's load, depending on the applications within that building. And it's a simple way to reduce carbon in a sustainable way. So I think that's the key driver. And then also, the trends we're seeing in the marketplace, because of events like COVID, is things like estate consolidation. Commercial businesses now are looking at their large estates. Do I really need all this, real estate? Flexible working has become almost normal. So do I need as much space? So there's lots of things to look at in terms of overall strategy of the real estate. But then how can we embed the smarter technologies into the assets left in order to really optimize them? And I think they're the trends the key trends that are driving it from my perspective.
Yeah, I'd probably add one more, Dan, and that's the premiumization of office space, where it is the office sector, and well-being. The need for well space, well buildings, and also to create a good environment for people who work in that building is also, I think, another driver that adds to the need to look at the lighting solution overall, alongside the energy, the costs, sustainability stories as well. And certainly with the lighting systems we have available today and human-centric lighting and the ability to sort of tune the frequencies, we can create systems that actually provide a well or can contribute significantly to the well building standards and basically create a better environment for all. I mean, we've seen projects in healthcare settings, for example, where by adding that human-centric lighting component, you actually have there are studies that actually show the positive benefit on patient health. So definitely in commercial buildings, that read across is there, and I think that's another driver that we should be thinking about as well.
I think it's a very good point, that, David. I think actually there's one of the additional benefits is around how do we create better spaces. Many of these spaces are, I guess, at best will in the world probably 7, 10, 15 years old, but quite possibly 25, 30 years old installations, and actually our understanding of the lit environment has changed dramatically in that point. And actually I use the phrase beyond carbon, but actually it's about how do we what additional benefits can we do by tackling the low hanging fruit. Before we move on to the barriers, actually, I was going to, David, I'm just going to come back to you, and if you can just explain Roche, and just in case some of the listeners have not, or the watchers have not familiar with what this is and where we're at.
Yeah, I mean, Roche restriction of hazardous substances. Somebody might correct me if I've got the actual acronym wrong, but basically, old fluorescent tubes, T5s, T8s, they contain some materials that really are not recyclable and are hazardous. So as of, I think it was 1st of February or 28th of February this year, then essentially the manufacture of those tubes is now, by law, no longer possible. So there will be no further manufacture of those types of fluorescent tubes, which basically means that once they need replacing, sure, there's inventory in supply chains, but once that inventory is gone, then a different solution is needed. And that solution these days, the only solution really is the LED lighting systems that we've been talking about. So there's a regulatory driver behind this, partly on a sort of health and safety grounds, but actually, the benefits, as we've said, are wide and varied beyond the health and safety needs as well.
And I think that's a good, it's a good point that I don't think everyone's always aware of, that while you might be able to see fluorescent tubes and other sources that may be in next year's list for ceasing in manufacturing, just becoming more scarce on the shelves in the wholesaler, and actually more expensive as a result. So there's something that we need to just be mindful of that. Matt, I was just going to come to you and actually with a question around, so if there's all these brilliant ideas of what we can do and all the benefits, but what do we think the barriers are? Why do we think it's too hard? It's kind of mentioned earlier. Why does it go in the too hard to deal with pile?
Like I said, I think it's down to priorities. It's priorities over the last few years for businesses have been changing based on factors out of their control. The pandemic first of all, then we saw the global supply chain issues, and component shortages and key components, which really disrupted lots of businesses. Then of course inflation. So certainly the businesses left to not change to LED have had to focus on other priorities, I suspect. That said, we're coming out of that now. So hopefully we'll start to see more acceleration with regards to LED adoption in commercial property. So, but it is, sometimes it is difficult to change, particularly when you're looking at your estate and deciding how to consolidate it. What buildings are we going to keep? Which buildings do we not need anymore, really, based on what's happened? And then also looking at those particularly old buildings, you can't just change the lights. Maybe the electrical infrastructure's, old and tired and needs updating. Maybe the BMS too, maybe the HVAC systems. So lots of businesses, I think, are analysing the holistic building and deciding on the best strategy before committing. Lighting on its own needs to be considered amongst all the other smart technologies that buildings can now adopt in order to, really drive decarbonisation.
I think that's a fair point. Have you got anything to add to that, David? Why do you think it's too difficult?
Yeah, I think it's complex. I mean, if you think of a big building, you tend to have a building owner, a developer maybe, then possibly it's leased. So there's tenants involved, and then you've got lease durations and breaks and the responsibilities of tenants versus landlords. Then you may have an FM company who's also contracted to maintain that building and has certain sort of projects and targets that they have to meet within their own FM contract, which could be usually is multi-year duration. And then you have potentially installers, contractors who would have to come on board, as well as actually consultants to design the scheme as well. So there's a lot of parties involved, and they can be complex projects, they can be simple projects, but because there's a lot of parties involved, it's not quite as simple as simply changing out the lighting. There's different stakeholders with different timescales, different priorities. So bringing that all together, I think, when you do get a project where all the stakeholders are aligned, then it can go very, very quickly. It can be done actually physically really well. But it does need all those different stakeholders to be aligned and to come together. And I think that's maybe just a natural, I wouldn't necessarily say it's a barrier. It's partly just a function of timing.
And maybe that's it. And I guess so. Giving the benefits that we obviously clearly we got. This is our day to day. Is it? Yeah. We obviously clearly see the benefits, but are there any things that could do what could lower the barriers to this? What could speed up the transition? I guess. Any thoughts on that? I don't know if we talked about this last time, to be fair, so it might be slightly out of the blue. So
yeah. No, well, I think capex priorities are for business. Is varied. Whether it's investing in it for growth. We still need capex in order to change lighting. There are now, lots of businesses out there, lighting manufacturers as well as service providers, providing more finance-based project solutions in order to kind of reduce that capex requirement. Because if you think about particularly businesses or organisations that have multiple buildings, multiple sites and estates, capex can only get you so far with regards to renovation. Whereas finance-based models allow you to do a lot more, a lot quicker. I think it's when we look at services like Light as a Service, it's typically about acceleration. So for the same amount of capex that I would have typically in a year to maybe look at lighting projects or building upgrade projects, I can renovate 10 buildings instead of one by using finance type services. So, that's where finance-based solutions really come into their own. It's driving acceleration and speed in a way that doesn't impact, a business's cash flow.
Yeah. I would add probably one more, Dan, and that's actually, and I probably would say this being a lighting manufacturer, is actually the solutions that manufacturers present. It doesn't have to be new for old, which could be expensive and could be difficult from an installation from a ceiling perspective. I think a lot of us now are looking at how do we do retrofit solutions through gear tray replacements or component replacements, where it's simpler, it's easy for the installer, it doesn't have to be so costly, and where you can still get most of the benefits from doing that. Simply take the old insides of the luminaire out, retain the outside body with all of its embedded carbon as well, and then refit essentially the inners of the light fitting, and immediately you get some of the benefits. So that's not always possible, but I think it's incumbent as well on lighting manufacturers, the lighting industry, to think a little more creatively in terms of solutions they can bring to ease the process, so it's not so costly and not so complicated. And I think that's the way we're also looking at a trend as well. And it's good for everyone. It's quicker, it's easier, it's cheaper, and also from a sustainability perspective, you're not taking down ceilings, you're not putting a lot of old light fittings in skips or landfill, or whether they're recyclable or not. Sometimes that's questionable as well. So I think we've got to be a little more creative in the way we look at how we can provide solutions as well.
Yeah,
I think that's a really. Sorry, go for it, Matt.
So I kind of agree. I think retrofitting is a good option in some cases, but it's also, the light sources are different. A fluorescent light source and a HID light source compared to an LED light source, the housing, the reflectors, they're different.
Yeah.
And often the time it takes to, modify something in the ceiling versus replacing it with a new fixture is often, prohibitive. So I think where we're looking more now is when we do design new LED lighting systems, that we design it with circularity in mind for the future. So replace the fluorescent with a LED product or LED system, but make sure that LED system is circular and upgradable, so that in the future we don't have to rip and replace fixtures and send waste to landfill. We can upgrade them in situ or remanufacture them.
And I think they're both excellent points. I think that's quite in a lot of the conversations we've retrofit our own offices out. So we've made sure it's right, and we did it because exactly what David said there, because it was quicker and faster and had less impact on the business, and we could change a floor plate in 3 days and without actually stopping our business. So, or indeed noticing any change other than in our energy consumption, to be fair, and the fact that we retained 80% of our carbon that was already embodied there. So great stories, but you're exactly right, Matt. It's not suitable for everything, and and that's part of that process, and particularly as the trend over the last 10 to 15 years, maybe not in the last 3 years, should we say, the idea of circularity coming back in. When LEDs came along, we tended to bake everything into a lump that was very difficult to modify or change, and actually bringing back some of the old strategies around how we used to design things that are maintainable are actually quite an interesting retrofit look back, as it were, or retrospective look back at. So.
Yeah, it's great to see the industry really taking that on board. It's everywhere I look now, it's not just us or Glamox or other. It's a broad range of manufacturers adopting circular principles, which is great for the industry.
So I'm going to moving on a bit then. Just have a look at the time, make sure we're okay. Because part of this conversation is around technology, and it's around LEDs, and we've already talked about that, and I think it's well established, but actually around the use of smart and a number of these technologies have been around for years. There's not that much new there, to be fair, but there is some stuff coming. We'll come on to future outlook in a bit, but why do you think, for us, once again, the benefits of different technologies are obvious, but why do we think some of the adoption has been quite slow?
Understanding, I think, the value that it offers, I think is for me is is the tricky part. What is smart lighting? For example, often what does it mean? So I think it's an educational piece for us as industry leaders to take to market, to get people to understand. I mean, I like to think of it in a very simple way. I'm a simple guy, so but if we think about what is smart lighting, anywhere indoor or outdoor where there are people working, there needs to be light. For us to work safely and comfortably in those areas. So naturally, we've got a already electrified network through lights. And so smart lighting for me is simply the making the fixtures themselves a bit more intelligent in terms of how they operate, but also including more advanced sensors than we typically see in the traditional lighting systems to capture data everywhere within the building. Data that can give you insights into how the building's used, and collate it over a period of time to give you those kind of insights into how the building is used, how it operates, and presenting that data in a format that allows people to analyze and investigate based on data insights rather than assumptions. And that's where, for me, what smart lighting is about. It's about adding data to a network that already exists in a relatively simple way, and providing more insights that enable businesses to analyze how space is used, to really understand what lighting energy load and consumption is based on real-time and historical data, and giving a business the tools to optimize lights, but also to integrate lighting with other services, in order to optimize the building and to optimize efficiency, improve health and safety, well-being, and space management. It's a key trend we're seeing in the market now. Is we talked about it before in terms of estate consolidation. How can we do more with less real estate assets? How occupied are my spaces? Have I got data to demonstrate to the business that we could achieve these business functions on 2 floors instead of 5 floors and rent 3 floors out and create space optimized that way? There's all kinds of use cases for smart lighting, and it's up to us as an industry to explain why you're looking at LED. Yes, it's a great win and it's a quick energy reduction and save, but it's also now all kinds of other possibilities in terms of smart and data that just weren't available before.
Yeah, I totally echo all of what Matt's just said. The benefits now are just very, very significant. But to the point about this, perhaps it might be considered to be slow adoption of some of these technologies. I don't know. It's a good question. I think maybe some of the earlier smart solutions perhaps didn't deliver necessarily on some of those benefits quite as easily as they might have been expected to. I think some of them are actually relatively complicated to install, maintain, and to operate, perhaps. And I think maybe there's an element of kind of fear of, am I really going to get these benefits? Do I really need them? And am I tying myself into some kind of complicated system that I'll then spend a lot of time having to maintain, and a lot of money trying to maintain? And I think, if you look back maybe 10 years, there's some validity of that in perhaps some of the early solutions and early stages. But I definitely think that's changing. Perhaps another sort of barrier there is lack of standardization as well. Protocols, technology protocols behind it haven't necessarily been standardized. But I do think that is changing now. The systems are maturing. They're much easier to install, much easier to operate and maintain. Perhaps not quite at the sort of the Apple end of consumer technology yet, but definitely moving in that direction with ease of use, and sort of bringing some of that kind of consumer technology that we're all used to at home on our smartphones actually into the office space and the commercial sectors as well. So yeah, I think we possibly should see an acceleration going forward now with some of these smarter systems on the back of better technologies, more reliable, more robust technologies, and easier to use and operate and maintain.
I'd completely agree with that, David. I think the biggest challenge we quite often get is that the pushback. I just want a light switch. Well, I can't really just give you a light switch. I have to give you something else. But that's usually off the back of past experience of incredibly complex systems that have then been, expensive to maintain or difficult, or something breaks. You're not quite sure how to understand it, and then while systems generally are relatively simple if you know what they are, in a busy FM world, when you're new to a building and you don't know what's behind a ceiling, then actually they can just be bamboozlingly complicated. But I think you're right. I think the move of consumer UX experience, user experience design and commissioning and using and reprogramming now, it's that we all get from Apple Technologies, you said there, actually is becoming a far easier way to actually integrate with more complex control systems. And maybe we need to get better at, we see it all the time because we see it change, and we also see what it used to be like, under the hood, as it were. But maybe we need to be better at explaining how much easier and how much more reliable it is now. Standardization is a very key part to that, actually, because actually some people don't want to be locked into certain systems. And how do we therefore get to that to then deliver all the insight that Matt rightfully identified? The possibilities are endless, but what is useful is very difficult to articulate, and where's the value? I think we need to get better at that. Just looking at the time, so I'll just move on. I've got a couple of questions that are popping up, but I'll just move on really. So what do we think the future is? And so what's the next big thing in lighting? I think I'll start with you, Matt. I think where do you think it's going?
Well, smart for sure. And I think David touched on it earlier, is we talk about decarbonisation and energy reduction a lot with lighting, but it's also now, you called it something else earlier, we call it the value beyond illumination, and everyone has a different phrase for it, but that's basically what it means. It's smart lighting is turning things on its head. Proactive lighting maintenance as opposed to reactive. It means that in the old world, someone saw a light was out, a phone call was made, a ticket was raised to somebody would then go and investigate, look at the light. Now it's on a dashboard and it's red instead of green, and it tells you what it is, where it is, what's failed. So moving to more proactive management of your lighting system in just a very simple way. The integration we talked about earlier, the smart sensing is really getting quite interesting now, so with sensors everywhere, we can start to really analyze the buildings, radiant temperature, humidity. In some cases, are there VOCs present, VOC detection, sound detection. If a building's 2 a.m. in the morning and sound is detected on the 11th floor and it should be empty, a notification to security, that kind of thing. But more importantly, it's about people and, the people that work and operate in these buildings, and circadian lighting, which is really about the health and well-being of people when they're working indoors. That's the next frontier, I think, for us in terms of developing ranges that allow for circadian entrainment, which is effectively letting the body know that it's night or daytime, and influencing the human biological system in a good way when we're indoors, but doing that in an energy efficient way, because there's ways to solve circadian lighting that don't require complex systems. You can just double the amount of light, or have a lot more windows and things like that to be circadian trained in an indoor environment. So, but that's not a practical solution if you're looking at your energy and your carbon. So we're now looking at how do we deliver circadian based systems in an energy efficient way. We've got a system called BioUp, which is basically able to do that. We'll start to roll that out to our future product categories. So that's the first thing. And then I think the second thing for us is what we touched on earlier, circular lighting, more looking at the life cycle of LED systems, making sure we can reduce waste to landfill, using new technologies like 3D printing in order to reduce the carbon, embedded carbon of product, throughout the full manufacturing process. And how can we develop new services for the future so that we can easily upgrade and change fixtures within the ceiling, and make sure that the housing and other components that can and will last can be modified and upgraded like we used to do in the old days of lamps.
Yeah, in terms of technology adoption, Dan, I still think there's a lot to do to make sure, we sort of simply put it as right light, right place, right time. I still think there's a lot to go to, with the technologies, both the lighting and the control solutions, to make that simple, easy, efficient, and universally adopted throughout a building. So I still think there's a lot to do to get the technology that is available today fully embedded, if you like, and adopted through a lot of commercial buildings. But then I think, I see it, like Matt said, really is you've got a light fitting pretty much spread throughout the whole floor plate in every floor of every building. And it doesn't just have to be a light. It can basically be a sensor. And you can put all those different types of sensors that Matt was referring to within the light fitting. So it basically enables you to manage a building in a smart way. So I think, lighting might, in time, who knows, essentially become the secondary function of the device that's in the ceiling that's monitoring the health of the building. Yes, it's also the device that provides the light, but basically it's part of the integrated building management system that essentially makes that building operate in the best interests of the people working in it. And I think that's it's people are talking about how this could work. Lots of questions about how to use the data, what that data formats is, structure, standardization, etc., integrations, many different types of building management systems, questions around who actually owns that data, and how do you then simplify what is an awful lot of raw data that might be being collected into any kind of usable form? So there's a lot of kind of open questions, a lot of things that, I think over time the industry will figure out. But to me, it's, the opportunity is to kind of move beyond just lighting and to think, the light as being a carrier to contribute to the management of the building in the wider sense, for the benefit of the people that work there. A lot to figure out, but directionally, I can see that's where the technology will take us.
And I think it's a very, it's an exceedingly valid point there. That, from both of you there, the application of making better, healthier spaces for people to be within a building or outside of a building. It's just a part of a understanding and how we deliver that. And actually, as research moves forward on exactly which elements of circadian we need to apply, it's interesting to to support what we're looking at and how to properly deliver it. Then actually that will help us be more efficient at doing that. And I think it's quite an important factor there, really, I think, is in how we make spaces that ultimately, if we're not lighting for people, then what are we lighting for? So if the idea of it, it becoming more integrated part of the building as a whole, as it were. So what you're saying there, David, is actually just it could be a carrier because it happens to have power, but there is more there. I think there is. I've got one more question before I'll open up, and I will ask any people that are listening, if they've got any questions, then please do tap them into the chat and we'll put them in. But actually, one question I was going to ask you, with the advent of, we're getting towards the end of generation 1 LEDs. Maybe you can argue that we're looking at maybe towards the end of generation 2 LEDs, actually. But actually, in really, as new technology doesn't fail in the way that old lamp technologies fails, do you think, how do we know when what we've put in has reached the end of life and it's no longer delivering what we think it might be delivering?
It's a really great question, because I'm going through that right now with a client, and in some cases it's obvious because it just doesn't last. We get catastrophic failure. Once one goes, 2 goes, then 5 go, then 10 goes, and all of a sudden everyone's panicking. So sometimes it's super obvious. Sometimes it really isn't. And the only way is, so we've started doing light level audits for buildings with existing LED. So we know how long they've been installed for, and in this particular case, 8 years plus. We know they're out of warranty. We know that their rated life has passed, given that it's a 24/7 operation building. So we know all those things, but the lights aren't failing and they're all on. And then you go and do a nighttime lux measurement reading around the place and find out that actually, yeah, it's no longer compliant with that particular customer standards. So in some cases, it's very difficult, and you could look around and think, well, there's not really a problem here until you analyze it properly. And sometimes you analyze it, and actually, they're still performing really well. And it's going to be quite hard to justify to the business we should, replace these. In other cases, it's glaringly obvious that we need to change them because they're simply no longer compliant, and safety has got to be, particularly in industrial applications, safety's got to be a priority, and making sure the light levels are compliant is key. So, yeah, that's my short answer.
David, do you have an opinion on that?
Yeah, it is a very good question, because it's very easy to think that, we'll move to a modular sort of environment and we'll change out what needs to be changed when it needs to be changed. But how do you really know when it needs to be changed? Because there is gradual degradation over time. I think, some of the driver technology now in lighting systems collects a lot of data, the health and usage data. And I think, perhaps the answer is in applying some of the on-condition maintenance and the continuous monitoring health and usage technology into the luminaire. And I do think that is emerging. So, you can get a kind of a life cycle picture of the usage of that luminaire, not just hours on, but the things like temperature, things like power consumption, which enable you to kind of form a picture of the health, the health of that particular device. So again, it's quite simple to say monitoring systems and the data it provide will be the panacea answer to all of this. It's quite easy to say it in principle. To actually do it in a simple way for FM companies or building owners and operators to be able to see that in simple terms on a dashboard. Some of it is there now, for sure, but the sort of life cycle monitoring maybe less so. But I do think it will come. I know there's different generation drivers collecting this data now, and how that is then used is still probably questionable or needs developing. But I think that will be the type of solutions that will emerge.
And I think that's a really good question. I think Matt raised a good point. Sometimes if it looks all right, it probably still is okay. And and then in some situations and context, if it's not what it needs to be, industrial, particularly, for example, it's not being what it needs to be or is deemed to be, is okay as long as it's a conscious decision, because someone has actually made that decision, as opposed to slipping into that sort of context. I think so. There's an interesting way need for technology to be able to support that sort of managed life of products that could just rattle on for thousands of hours without appearing to be all okay. I will move to a couple of questions that we've got on the Q&A, and let's see what we've got here. So going back to sort of cost conversations and how to look at the return on investment, the question is, what do you think is the best way to communicate long-term savings and return on investment of switching to LED technology to commercial stakeholders who are hesitant due to upfront costs? What's the best way to? I'll go to you first, David, I think, on this one.
Yeah, I think validity of the data. I think it's being honest and objective in the data. Because I think, sometimes people are a little bit skeptical that the benefits really do match the calculations that are done. So I think, people trusting the data and showing exactly where that data comes from so that they are confident in the benefits as part of it. I think doing pilots and trials in people's buildings is very good. That's, some things we've done a couple of times is, if you've got a 6-story building or something, take a half a floor, do that, run it for 3 months, measure it, test it, and then, you can you can see it in practice live, and know that it will then apply to the rest of the building. I think maybe there's also, as Matt was alluding to earlier, there's different commercial models that might come into play here as well. I don't think the industry's got here yet, but sort of commercially underwriting savings to a certain level could provide some confidence. Perhaps that's one that is a little more difficult, but I think if it's supported by good data, that's there. And just good old-fashioned sort of reference points and case studies as well. I think where we have done this for clients, generally speaking, clients end up very pleased, and they're quite happy to provide reference points or case studies, or even allow people who might be considering it into their building to look at the type of solution. So there's maybe a mixture of kind of old-fashioned and new models that might be applied here. So yeah, I do think people are starting to understand very much the business cases, and now it's a case of how can we do it, and overcome some of the barriers we were talking about earlier.
Brilliant, thank you. Anything to add on that, Matt? I've got one last question on to ask before time's up. But
no, fully agree. It's but for those that are still not sure, I think David hits a good point. Is measurement and verification. Facts. Do it. Monitor the lighting circuits of a particular area. Do a trial install. Monitor it before and after install. Give the customer as much factual evidence based data to make that informed decision, see the lit effects, and then hopefully move forward with confidence. But the upfront audit is critical. Getting the right data of a good baseline is critical, but also making sure that the new design is well thought out, well thought through, and delivers what the client needs. So it should be two things: a good audit and a good design, and it leads to a good business case.
Brilliant, thank you. And I guess the other question that is come through, slightly connected to smart, or very connected to smart. So the reference smart lighting, one supplier now is fitting sensors for CO2, humidity, temperature, for which we are trialing. As you mentioned, we don't have the air services, etc., to support the data to integrate this with our HVAC. How far off is this? And was the previous presentation from Bill at Novascene could assist with? Possibly. I had technical problems, so I didn't dial into the previous call, unfortunately.
Probably N2.
So I guess the question is, how far off broader systems are we?
We can do that now. So integration through BACnet or integration through APIs is now completely possible to integrate. So you talk about the future of what's the future of lighting. The data part is becoming even more important, but having it in an open source way. So we as a business release APIs for developers to work out what to do with that data and how to present it, or for developers to create apps on phones to be able to control lighting in a particular way. And integrating with electrical services is very much possible, providing the other services are integratable and have been updated. But typically it's BACnet, typically it's APIs, but we can do both today. And I think many other manufacturers can too.
Anything to add on that, David?
No, not really. I think sort of Matt hit the nail on the head. I think maybe planning is perhaps one other little thing to add is think it through at the start of a building refit or a refurb. All the data requirements, all the data formats, lighting, HVAC, all the different building management systems, and plan it up front. If that's possible, then an integrated solution can be designed. It can be harder to kind of piece together the different systems later on down the line as each system is updated or upgraded through the building life. So if you do have that opportunity up front, then yeah, that's probably the right time to think it through and plan it if that opportunity is there.
And I think
I guess just to add to that, understanding what the client wants to get to in terms of the end point, the end game, and then as a team, collective team, whether it's the lighting manufacturer, the HVAC supplier, the BMS supplier, the systems integrator, working together to achieve that end goal. And it's all possible. It's just a question of collaboration and teamwork.
Absolutely, and I think that's a a great point that this is all possible, even through open protocol KNX systems, and therefore, we talked about closed systems before, but I guess one of the challenges there that is, lighting has been very aware of its accessibility and usability for the end user, and therefore that I think that's been a real barrier to the integration when you embed it inside a BMS system, and therefore, the UX experience has been developed separately, and now we're trying to link it back in again. It'd be nice to see BMS systems reconsider the way that they actually go about their programming there and adaptation and maintenance of that to allow easier integration. But maybe that's a challenge to elsewhere in the industry. So I think that brings us up to time, and I think that is like to thank you both, David and Matt, for joining me. And it's been a useful conversation. And Jordan, hopefully, we did you.
Perfect. Thank you, Dan. That was excellent moderating. Thank you so much. And thank you, David and Matt. I appreciate you all for that very in-depth discussion.
You're welcome. Nice to meet you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Thanks, Dan.